score, looking at those teacher-child interactions, those quality interactions in the classroom. Based on that composite score, you can receive a certain number of points, 50 points max. Learning gains is looking at how the child grew from the first progress monitoring to the third progress monitoring that they take. And you can receive up to 30 points max for this category. And then the last component that's worth 20 points or 20% of your score is achievement. Achievement is looking at the last progress monitoring at what percentage of children met that kindergarten ready score. Right now, the State Department Division of Early Learning is looking at a score of 707, as stated in rule as kindergarten ready for that achievement score. So let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about the criteria to receive a VPK performance metric. So to receive a performance metric, of course, you have to be a VPK provider implementing the VPK program, and you have to have data for all three components. That means you need to have a class, VPK class composite score, and you need to have some data for learning gains and achievement on the FAST assessment or the progress monitoring that the children take. Also, you need to have at least a minimum of 4 VPK children that have completed at least over more than 50% of the total number of instructional hours in your program. Okay, at least 50% of those VPK hours that you offered needed to have been completed by 4 children. If you do not meet any of these criteria to receive a performance metric, what will happen is that you will receive an incomplete designation. So basically, you won't have a score because there's not enough data to provide you with a score. Now, you won't be penalized for having an incomplete. It's just that a designation, unfortunately, will not be able to be provided because there wasn't enough data. I know there's going to be a question maybe on change of ownerships that sometimes that does occur if you're a new provider that just went through a change of ownership with another school. You will receive a VPK performance designation if the VPK hours that were completed, at least more than 50% of the VPK hours were completed at your school, at your center. If less than 50% of those hours were completed because the other hours were completed, let's say at the other school, then you will receive an incomplete designation. And if you have any questions, we will address them at the end of the presentation, but I want you to go ahead and you can go ahead in the Q&A section, put in your questions and we'll answer them as we go through. So VPK provider performance designation. This will be the first year again that you will receive this score, and it is calculated and given within 45 days after the conclusion of the school year or summer VPK program. The designation will be based on the total number of points earned. And here's the breakdown of the points. So the total number of points earned in the three components that we discussed, the quality, the learning gains, and the achievement. So if you receive 60 points or higher, you're going to get the designation of excellent. 46 to 60 points would be above expectations. 28 to 45 points, you're looking at meets expectations. 16 to 27 points is below expectations. And 0 to 15 points is unsatisfactory. Basically, each program will need a minimum of at least 28 points to be at that meeting expectation designation. You want to make sure that that's at least the minimum number of points that you're reaching. If not, you will be fall either in below expectation or unsatisfactory. What will happen to programs that fall in the below expectation or unsatisfactory designations is that unfortunately for the next school year, the next VPK school year, you will be considered a provider on probation and will have to implement an improvement plan in your VPK program. Now, we don't know all the details of how that improvement plan will look like for next year because currently that's still undergoing into rule and being evaluated by the Division of Early Learning. But as soon as that data is available, we will go ahead and release that. But in the meantime, just so you know, you do need at least 28 points not to be considered a provider in probation and be placed on an improvement plan. So let's talk a little bit more about component one, the quality component. This is that component that's looking at your composite class observation score for your VPK program. Now, some of you, your programs have school readiness as well. This component is only looking at that VPK score, not your school readiness score. And that VPK score is the composite score, the average of all your VPK classrooms together, if you have more than one VPK classroom. There is a maximum of 50 points for this component that you can receive. And the breakdown of how many points you can receive depending on your score, you will see it in the section on the screen that says scoring breakdown. So if you receive below 4 points, you receive below a 4.0 on your class score, you receive 0 points. And the reason for that is because you need at least a 4.0 in order to have a VPK contract for next year. 4.0 is the minimum class score that you can receive. So below 4.0, we're looking at 0 points. From 4.0 to 4.49, we're looking at 5 points. From 4.5 to 4.99, we're looking at 10 points. From 5.0 to looking at 20 points. From 5.5 to 5.99, we're looking at 30 points. 6.0 to 6.49, 40 points. And 6.5 to 7, 50 points. 7 is the maximum score that you can receive in the class observation. If you've already received a class observation for VPK this year, depending on your score, you can already see what number of points you will be allotted for this component. Component two is the learning gains. This one is a little more tricky because there is a whole equation that comes into play here. But basically, for learning gains, you can be allotted up to 30 points. 30 points is the maximum that you can receive. And what they are looking for is that children in the VPK school year program made at least 12 unified scale score points or more per month, a growth rate of 12 USS points. That's your score that you receive on Renaissance when the children's test. So they're looking at an average of 12 USS points or more per month for the VPK school year program. For the summer program, they're looking at an average of 40 USS points or more per month. Or if the child scored really high at the highest literacy classification, which is a score of 852 or higher, that at least the child was able to be maintained in that same classification, that they didn't go down. And there is a small percentage of students that might fall into that category. So how do they determine if the child is making these learning gains? They're going to use the equation that you see there in the calculation section. They're looking at progress monitoring 3 and progress monitoring 1. And they're going to subtract those scores from each other and then divide it by the number of calendar days between PM1 and PM3 test administration dates and then multiply by 30. That will give them the score to see if the child made those learning gains of at least 12 points per month. They are looking overall at what percentage of the students enrolled in your VPK program actually made those learning gains. So the children that are going to count for you to receive points in these learning gains are the percentage of children that actually met the expected growth rate. Okay, so let's say you have 10 VPK students, but only 8 met the expected growth rate of that 12 USS points per month. Then those 8 are the ones that are going to be considered to get that you can get points for. The other 2 children, you won't receive points on them because they didn't make those minimum learning gains. So they're going to take the percentage of children meeting the expected growth rate and then multiply that by 100 and then by 30%, and scores are rounded to the nearest whole number. If it's zero point 0.5 or greater is rounded up, and if it's less than zero point 0.5 is rounded down. And that's how you're going to get your points for learning gains. For component 3, for achievement, you're looking at a maximum of 20 points. This one is a little easier to calculate. This component is just looking at that progress monitoring 3, that last progress monitoring that children take the last 30 days of VPK. They're looking at an achievement score or kindergarten ready score of 707. So this is gonna be calculated by looking at the percentage of eligible children in your program that demonstrated kindergarten readiness. Basically, that scored a 707 or higher on their progress monitoring 3. And then they're gonna take that percentage by multiply it by 100 and then by 20%. And scores again are rounded to the nearest zero point 0.5. Zero point 0.5 or greater are rounded up, and less than zero point 0.5 are rounded down. What the Division of Early Learning or Department of Education has done to be able to better help assist with this information and for you to be able to understand this information is, even though this is the first year that a performance metric will count and will be assigned to your programs, the department has taken the data from 22-23 program year and assigned performance designation. So there is a performance designation already assigned for your program if you had VPK in 22-23, and you can see how many points and how you performed in that school year. Now, this is for informational purposes only. You are not penalized for these scores or anything like that. This is for informational purposes only, so you can see how your program did in the 22-23 program year, and you can kind of get an understanding of how this is being calculated looking at your own scores and your own data. I've included on this slide, which I also put on the chat, the link to be able to access this. On the website, you can see a red arrow. This is a screenshot of what the website looks like. If you click on that PDF document, you offered VPK in 22-23, your school should be listed there. You can do a control F to find your school. There are many schools listed there, and go ahead and view your school information to view this data. And I find that looking at this data really helps in understanding the calculation, having that data there. So this is the summary for all of Florida, just looking at 22-23 data. And I wanted to go ahead and look at some of this with you guys because it shows how many programs uh, and the different designations that the programs received in all of Florida. Okay, so you're going to see the different designations in blue assigned, whether it's unsatisfactory, below expectations, meets expectations, above expectations, or excellent, and you will see how many programs fall into each category. Now, if you notice, as you go down the row, you're going to see the average achievement score for the programs with this designation. So, for example, if you fall under unsatisfactory, which is 0 to 15 points, there was 107 VPK programs in all of Florida that fell in this category, which makes up 1.9% of all the programs, VPK programs in Florida. The average achievement score for children, so that average PM3 score for children in these programs was a 701, just below that kindergarten readiness of 707. Okay, so we're looking at only 22.4% of those children enrolled in that program actually met that kindergarten score. For the programs in the 0 to 15 category, we saw a growth rate of 7.6. Okay, only that was the growth rate of every month. And we talked about before that there needed to be at least a minimum of 12. And the average of these programs was 7.6. So only about 7% of children in these programs were meeting learning gains. And the average class score in this designation of unsatisfactory was 4.3. Now I want you to see something interesting. As the designations go from the lowest to the highest, you see that the class score went from lowest to highest, the average class score for all programs. That might not be true for every program, but the average of programs, as the higher the class score, you see that the higher the designation is. Not only do you see that the higher the designation is, but you also see the higher the achievement average of children. You're looking at a whole 90 points. Also, the higher the growth rate in children, you're looking at almost a whole 10 points in growth rate between the lowest and the highest expectation. Why did I want to show this chart to you guys? A lot of times it makes us nervous, especially children testing and having this progress monitoring data and having this VPK accountability. But this data is really important for us to see because it's showing how class is tied to all of this. And although class is only a one-time observation, a snapshot in time of your program that you receive every year, um, it just gives us an idea of what the classroom interactions are occurring or what they look like in your classroom. And the higher the quality interactions in your classrooms, we're seeing data that the higher the achievement and the learning gains are for the children. So it's very important to try and understand the class tool as much as possible, train your teachers, because ultimately there is a tie between achievement and learning gains and that class score. And class is weighted for a whole 50% of your performance metric. You can get up to 50 points. That is a lot of points. And you need at least 28 points to not be a provider on probation, to be at that meeting expectation. So a little breakdown of Florida. In Miami-Dade County, um, below expectation, we only saw 83 schools in the 22-23 program year. That's only 9% of our schools. In all of Florida, we saw a 12.1%. I wanted to show you guys this because I know we're scared of what providers on probation and everything that you guys have experienced before with readiness rates. But 9% of the total number of VPK providers that we have falling below designation, and this being the first year that this was implemented, the FAST and the class on VPK, is actually not bad at all. So the majority of providers did not fall in what would be considered a provider on probation. And that's actually really good news. That's actually really good data. Here we have some data on the summer, on our summer VPK for 22-23. And again, we're seeing the same thing. The higher the average class score was, depending on the designation that they got, you saw a higher average class score and higher average learning gains as well. And this is that breakdown summary for the summer. In Miami-Dade and Monroe, only one summer program received some designation below expectation. It jumps to 11% because it's so few providers in summer that's why that percentage looks so small, so large, but it really was only one program. And in Florida, there was only 17 programs in the summer. So what are some keys to success? Some keys to success in order to make sure that you're doing everything in your power to be successful with this performance metric designation is number one, class. Become very familiar with class, the class tool, and provide trainings for all your teachers. Training is power. Even if you've taken the training before, you guys are observed in class every year. Taking a refresher training is always a good idea. There's always room for improvement. I also suggest requesting a detailed report to see the areas for improvement. When you receive your class composite score from our class department, when you receive that by email, you're just or receive it and see it on Wells. You're only seeing your class score, but you don't know you don't know the detailed notes or the report. You don't receive it unless you request it. If you've never seen the detailed report of how you obtained your class score, which has the notes of what happened during each area that the observer observed, I suggest that you request it because that gives a lot of insight as to things that scored very well and areas that need improvement. And you can request it by emailing classinfo@elcmdm.org. And if you need someone to go over that report with you, you can also request that as well. And their staff willing to go over the report with you to so you can have a better understanding of your score. It's very important that you understand your score because understanding your score, that's how you will see what areas you can improve in. There's also, even though it's limited, there also is some coaching available within our class department. And if you are interested in receiving coaching, you can also email our class info@elcmdm.org. I believe there is a list or a waiting list, but they can go ahead and put you on that list. So when they get to you, a class coach can go out to your classroom and provide coaching to the teacher. The second key to success is suggesting to closely monitor learning gains on progress monitoring. You have to make sure every child who is able to attempt a test or attempts to test during the designated windows. Now I know that there's some exemptions where the child was is just not inappropriate, is inappropriate for that child to test. So that child may not test and may receive a non-participation status for assessment inappropriate, or they attempted to test and they failed to practice multiple times, so they were not able to proceed to the assessment. That is a small percentage of children, but overall, the majority of children are able to test. If the child is able to test and it is appropriate, make sure you are testing them during the progress monitoring window. Let's say a child was absent during and you decided to test the last week of your progress monitoring window and they were absent. That is one child less that you don't have data for. That they could have made those learning gains or made that achievement score, but you didn't receive data for that child because they didn't test during the window. It's very important to test during the window and not wait till last minute because children can be absent, children can get sick, families may have to go out of town for X and Y reason. So it's very important to schedule your testing, inform families, and give children enough time so if a child is absent or not in school, they are able to take the assessment. You can also download the instructional planning report once the children test. This report helps with lesson planning in the areas that our children are ready to learn. It's basically going to show you for the assessment the child score and the different areas where the children are ready to learn or make learning gains. It's going to have like a little lightning mark next to those areas. And this assessment is basically saying these are the areas that the child is ready to learn to move on to the next skill. And that helps the teacher when it comes to working with that child and taking that child moving to that next step. Sometimes I know we can get frustrated as teachers and be and not know what activity or what lesson we're going to do with this standard or this area that the child needs to improve in. I suggest using our available activity plans palette from the Division of Early Learning. If you click that blue link on the presentation, you're going to see lesson plans in English and in Spanish. Some in Spanish are available for each of the domains of the Florida Early Learning Standards. Tons and tons of lesson plans that you can use in your program already done for you guys. Go ahead and take advantage. You can see the areas of improvement on that instructional planning report that the children are ready to learn, and go ahead and go into the activity plans and pull those lesson plans that you know are going to help that child. And lastly, you want to make sure you're keeping families informed. Use that STAR parent report and provide it to the families. And take the opportunity to speak with your families of the importance of these scores. What does these scores mean? What is the Division of Early Learning look at? What does this mean for kindergarten readiness? Because families are your biggest support system with the children at home. And you want to make sure that you guys are working together for the child's success. Lastly, there's also the New Worlds Reading Program. For any child who fell below the 40th percentile on any of the three assessments done in the VPK school year, they qualify for free books all the way from VPK to fifth grade. So they're going to receive, I think it's 8 or 9 books a year, completely free. And there are some bilingual books available as well. I believe English, Spanish, Creole, and Braille. This is very important to give the information to the families. If you see that the child fell below that 40th percentile on their score, go ahead and give this QR code or send this picture to the families so they can get their free books. We know that reading and books and reading at home and reading together are all things that help encourage literacy. And being exposed to print material and reading material is important for children. Have families take advantage of this opportunity. And lastly, on Progress Monitoring 3, there will be something new that happens this year, and that is the Summer Bridge program. If there are any children, for any reason, that on Progress Monitoring 3 fell below the 10th percentile, or had a non-participation status of assessment inappropriate, or failed practice, or non-English speaker. So for some reason they weren't able to complete that third assessment because it just wasn't inappropriate, or they failed the practice, or receive another non-participation status, they're going to be eligible for a summer bridge program. Basically, summer bridge is like a summer school, okay? A VPK program that these students will be able to attend in the public school system. It will be offered by school districts during the summer prior to kindergarten entry. So it's to help them support their learning a little bit more just before they enter that kindergarten. Take advantage of the summer. And it's free. I believe it's going to be about 4 hours a day. And there's going to be more information coming out about Summer Bridge. This is still being worked out with the district, but it is going to be offered by the public school. Now, for Progress Monitoring 3 in Renaissance, if any child is eligible for this because they fell below that 10th percentile or had that non-participation status, there will be a letter that automatically is available to print to provide to those families. And the system will tell you which children those are and they qualify to print the letter to the families and give them to the families. Because ultimately, this is going to be something that's parent choice. It's provide the information to the families and encourage them to take advantage of this opportunity if they do qualify. I've included here on the last slide some resources of things we discussed. Very important is the DEL VPK program accountability webpage. This is where you'll find the 22-23 data scores, and this is where the Division of Early Learning will be posting any updates about VPK accountability. They're currently working on 23-24 scores, so scores for last year, and when the scores are published for this year, at the end of the program year, they will also be published on that website. The Division of Early Learning has also provided a guide, so a document guide to calculating the performance metric designations. I've also included the memo and the rule reference so in case you guys want to access that information. So I will go ahead and stop sharing, and I'm going to look at any questions in the chat. If you have any questions, go ahead and you can put them in the Q&A in the chat or the chat section, and we can go ahead and answer some of those questions.
Sydney, I can read some of the questions for
Okay,
you. So
okay.
we do have a question that says, how do all of these metrics take into account the context of the children and the school? For example, children who speak English as a second language, immigrant children and families, children in school for the first time.
So obviously you will be receiving a diverse population of children in your programs, such as you stated, non-English speakers, immigrant children, etc. There are 3 evaluations that happen during the school year in the VPK program. Of those 3 evaluations, the first one is a baseline. You're not penalized for anything that happens in that first evaluation. So we encourage for that to happen. Now, as the school year progresses, children will make some type of learning gains. There will be learning gains that happen with those children. Some may be more than others. That depends on each child, and they will kind of learn that English acquisition as the program progresses. I know they go through that silent period, children, where maybe they don't verbalize or speak a lot of English, but by the end of the year, they are able to understand a lot. Um, so if you have children like that in your program now, I suggest if you've already done the first progress monitoring on those children, now you're doing progress monitoring too. Now is the opportunity to see where the children have grown and what are areas that they need for development. And you're able to download those reports like the instructional planning report and see what are the areas that that child might need more help in. Maybe it's vocabulary. They're still building that English vocabulary. They know the content in Spanish, but they still need more help in learning that vocabulary in English. Now you know what area more or less the teacher needs to work on. Also, the class observation is not necessarily done in English. The class observation is able to be done in Spanish if you request it. Or if the class is bilingual, because the teacher is bilingual, speaking to bilingual children in the classroom, we have bilingual assessors. So whatever interactions happen in the classroom, whether English, Spanish, Creole, we document all of that, all of those quality interaction, regardless of the language that it is in, and you get credit for that. So I don't know if that helps a little bit. Also, in the STAR assessment, even though it is administered in English, that family STAR parent report is available in Spanish to give to families. Um, and also, when taking the assessment, don't be afraid to talk to the children. You're not allowed to help them during the test, but you are able to talk to them before and tell them in Spanish or Haitian Creole, whatever languages they speak in. If you can speak their language, let them know, hey, we're going to be going on the computer. They're going to be asking you some questions in English. I don't want you to be scared. Just try your best and select what you think it is. Please just don't throw children out there and they don't even know what they're doing. It's hard enough that they don't know the language and maybe they don't understand what the person is asking them. But you can always talk to children and prepare children before so they understand what's going to be happening and that they will be asked questions in English so they can feel at least a little more prepared. So, next
Sydney,
question,
another
Andrea.
yes,
Mhm.
another question is if we receive unsatisfactory or below expectations, will we still get a VPK contract?
So if you receive unsatisfactory or below expectation, for next year, you will still receive a VPK contract unless you received a 4.0 or less on the class score. If you received less than a 4 on the class score, then you wouldn't. But if you received a 4 in the class score and your average performance metric was below expectations in any of those two categories, you will still get a contract. It's just that you will be placed as what is known a provider on probation, meaning that you will have to implement an improvement plan during the whole year of VPK next year until the school is able to meet that meeting expectation designation. We are still awaiting more information from the Department of Education regarding that.
Next question is I have a child that is just being registered for the VPK program for the 24-25 school year. Will that child or the school be penalized for this late enrollment?
So for late enrollment, you're not penalized. The only thing is that you won't receive learning gains for a child that enrolls late in your program because they weren't able to test for progress monitoring 1. So that child won't be accounted for when they do the learning gains because there's no progress monitoring 1 data for that child in your program. However, that child is still able to qualify and you're able to receive points for that child for how they perform on progress monitoring 3 for the achievement section.
If you are incomplete, would you still be getting a VPK contract, for example, in a change of ownership?
If you are incomplete, you are not penalized for having an incomplete status. That just means that there wasn't sufficient data to give you a designation. So anyone that receives an incomplete will not be penalized and you are able to have a VPK contract the following year.
How will this work for students with special needs who do not show much growth during PM testing?
So children with special needs, if they are able to test, there are some children that are not able to test and they're just marked as assessment inappropriate. Um, but if they are able to test, what will happen is that those children will not be taken into account in the percentage of learning gains if they did not meet those minimum learning gains that has been published in rule, which is the school year 12 points per month in the average or summer program the 40 points per month. There's some children who are special needs that will surprise you and are able to make the learning gains, but there's some that unfortunately are not there yet. Even though they did make some learning gains, they didn't meet those minimum uh, points. So they would not be accounted for when they do the calculation in that percentage of children.
What if the child had a PM1 in another school and will now be completing PM3 in our school, so a different school? Will the
So
learning gains be counted?
so learning gains, they're looking that PM1 and PM3 was completed in your school. If PM1 was completed in another school, you won't receive points for learning gains for that child. Since that child is now with you for PM3, you will only receive achievement points for that child if they score that minimum achievement score.
What if you started your VPK program in the middle of October and did not get to do the first PM1 testing? Can we still get points and which points?
Can you repeat that?
So I'll be able to answer that question. If you started at a later, if your VPK program started at a later date, your metrics, your PM1 will start the first 30 instructional days of your first VPK, first day of VPK. So if you are starting in October, let's say you started October 1st, that is your first day for PM1. So you should still have been able to have tested the first 30 days of PM1.
That's why your VPK calendar is so important because your PM1, your PM2, and your PM3 dates are based on your VPK calendar. So if your start date on your VPK calendar is October, it's looking at the first 30 days there. So yes, you do have PM1 data. That's why everyone's PM scores are different because everyone's VPK calendar might be different.
How do you identify children who have a disability and do we need to submit any paperwork?
So children that have a disability and are not able to test, they should have either an IEP or 504 plan or some type of documentation saying that that type of assessment is inappropriate for them. And then you would assign them on the progress monitoring section assessment inappropriate. Now, once the ELC has to verify that every child has been tested, and if a child did receive a non-participation status of assessment inappropriate, we would ask for documentation as to why that child was marked that way. The documentation could be, again, an IEP, a 504 plan that specifies so, or in some cases, I have had the provider just write an email because they've attempted multiple times and the child just refused to sit or take the test. So just letting us know that when we request that documentation so we can go ahead and file that.
What if we do not have an IEP or documentation? How can we demonstrate that the child has a delay?
So if you do not have any documentation, if you don't have any documentation, the child may have a delay, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the assessment may be inappropriate for that child. It may not be. You should attempt to provide the assessment to the child. If the child is not able to complete it, the, the assessment should close out and it will show a failed practice. And we have that documentation, that the child failed the practice. And that's why they weren't able to complete it. And then you can give the designation because the designation of assessment inappropriate, you know from seeing this child's development that this is just not appropriate for this child and you attempted and the child failed the practice and was not able to proceed the assessment. That would be your documentation showing that you attempted and they failed the practice and wasn't able to proceed. An evaluation from their ABA therapy, we have to take these things on a case by case basis. It all depends on what the documentation says. So if you have a question about a specific child and have documentation that you want to show us, just go ahead and send it to us on vpkteam@elcmdm.org. I'm putting it on the chat. You can email us the documentation for the child and the child in question, and we can give you a better response.
For Maria Nunez, that you have a specific question, your VPK calendar is for August, but you didn't have the fourth child until October. Please email us at VPK team. That is the specific case that we're going to have to talk with you about. So please email us at vpkteam@elcmdm.org.